1 week season.
Hello, friends and Inner Circle fam. Welcome to the week 1 edition of the 2024 1 week season roster review stream. I'm your host, StatATL. Back by popular demand again this season is the roster review show. And on this episode, we will be reviewing more than a dozen subscriber submitted rosters. So let's hop in here with a single entry build from Inner Circle member Phantom Menace. So Phantom Menace started this $50 single entry with 4,500 entrants in the contest with a Josh Allen skinny stack with Khalil Shakir. He ran it back with James Conner. So I love that correlation and start to the roster. However, that is where the correlation ends on this particular build. So the roster then features Kenneth Walker, Tyreek Hill, Tank Dell, Mike Gesicki, and Ladd McConkey all as one-offs. Outside of Gesicki, who I understand is a pivot off of the very highly owned Ishibash, I had all the others in my player pool this week. So I do like the plays. I would just rather see you add more correlation to the build. Instead of Ladd or Dell, I'd rather see Christian Kirk for a mini correlation with Tyreek Hill. Maybe instead of Walker, you pair the Texans D with Mixon for leverage off of the chalky Anthony Richardson builds. And so a lack of correlation doesn't mean your roster can't win. It's just more things that you have to get right. So thank you for the submission this week, Phantom Menace. The next build comes from AAK15, and this is a $9 roster in the slant, which features 26,000 entrants. It's a Baker Mayfield skinny stack with Mike Evans and brought it back with Terry McLaurin. So I did like this start here. Roster also features 2 Jags, Christian Kirk and Engram, along with Devon Achane as a bet on that game shooting out. So personally, I don't love rostering 2 pass catchers and then not including their quarterback, which in this example would have been Trevor Lawrence. I'd rather see you spend the $600 more to go from Baker to Trevor Lawrence, because if Christian Kirk and Engram are combining to had to have it score, then T-Law is putting up a score that's very strong and isn't hurting you as well. I do like the pivot off of Tyreek Hill to Devon Achane, kind of betting on the touchdowns flowing through him instead of Hill. And it's a really good leverage play in a 26,000 entrance tournament. Roster also features Ford and Addison as one-offs. I don't mind either of those plays. And the Steelers defense is a great pivot away from all the chalky ATL pieces between Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and Kyle Pitts. So overall, I think this build is fine. Along with rostering Lawrence, I probably would have gone away from Addison to Cooks to get a mini correlation. Or I would have gone off of Ford to Singletary if you had stayed with Addison. I think if you need the salary relief from making those changes, going from Evans to Godwin still keeps the correlation with McLaurin, and he's $1,500 cheaper, so it gives you a little bit more of that flexibility. And then finally, the roster has Christian Kirk in the flex spot. So strictly from a construction perspective, I'd rather you ensure your latest playing wide receiver, so either Evans or McLaurin, is in this spot to kind of give you the maximum flexibility with late spot. So AAK15, thank you for the submission this week. So the next roster comes from OWS subscriber Sean Hackbarth. This is a $12 single entry into a 15,000 entrant field. It is a Josh Allen skinny stack with Shakir, no bringback. The roster also features Tyreek Hill and Devon Achane, again with no bringback. So mentioned previous episodes throughout OWS, like you don't have to have bringbacks and you don't have to have correlation, but it's something that I personally am an advocate for. It's just less things that you have to get right. So it's likely that if both Achane and Tyreek are putting up scores that you had to have, which at their prices you need 30 points each, if not more. Someone on Jacksonville is pushing them or having a decent game. So personally, I'd rather see Christian Kirk, Brian Thomas Jr. Here instead of Tank Dell. And finally, the roster features Kenneth Walker and Greg Dulcich as a mini correlation, which I liked. I played that as well myself. If we're going to move away from Dell to Kirk or Brian Thomas Jr., I'd rather see you play Greg Dortch here instead to correlate with your Allen Shakir stack, kind of at that same price point, instead of A.D. Mitchell. Thank you for the submission this week, Sean. So the next roster comes from Strictly Business. This is a $1 entry into the 20 max contest, which has 230,000 entrants. So a bit of a lotto here. This roster is Anthony Richardson naked with both Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell. So just kind of off the hop here, while I love Richardson, there is no way I'm playing both Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs in a lineup and not including Stroud. Since you need at least 50 from Dell and Diggs combined. And if they're doing that, Stroud is basically guaranteed to be putting up a score that doesn't hurt you. So while you could certainly play Richardson, this is just one more thing that you have to get right. Whereas if Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell are putting up a great game, that likely means Stroud is as well. That doesn't necessarily mean that Richardson is. You know, those points could be coming from Jonathan Taylor on the ground. Roster also features Justin Jefferson and Malik Neighbors in a mini correlation. I do really like that. You've got J.K. Dobbins and Rico Dowdle both as one-offs, as well as Taysom Hill. So while all three of these made my player pool, I'd rather see Brock Bowers here instead of Taysom Hill to correlate with J.K. Dobbins. Or if you wanted to keep Taysom Hill, I'd rather see Hubbard here at running back to pair with Taysom. So the Bears D at home, strong play at moderate ownership, and appreciate submission this week. Those would be the changes that I would make to this build, Strictly Business. So the next build comes from Hunter Sanders. This is a $40 10 max, 1,500 entrants in this contest. It's a Josh Allen skinny stack with Khalil Shakir, no bring back. It's got J.K. Dobbins and the LA Chargers for the running back defensive special teams correlation. I like that. Was something that I did myself quite a bit. The roster then also features a mini correlation with Kirk and Tyreek Hill. Also something I did several times myself. I like that this past weekend. I thought that was a strong construction. Roster then has Kenneth Walker, Kyle Pitts, and Rome Odunze all as one-offs. So I don't mind it. I'd rather see you consider like one more piece of correlation. So I think personally, I would have considered OWS favorite Greg Dortch instead of Odunze on this build, or I would have played Brock Bowers instead of Pitts to correlate with Dobbins and the Chargers D. Since if those two are hitting, it's likely the Raiders are behind and throwing more. Hunter, thank you for your submission this week. The next roster comes from Based Dad. It's a $27 single entry with 4,300 entrants in the contest. As you see, this is a Baker Mayfield double with both Godwin and Evans. No bring back. So again, is a bring back required? No. Will I personally almost always do it, especially with a double stack? Yes. So the roster then features a game stack with Jefferson, Munt, and Neighbors. So I think if you're punting with tight end, I'd rather see Ertz on a build like this to correlate with your Bucks double instead of Munt. Again, not something you have to do. It's just a personal preference of mine. You then have Walker and Hubbard here as one-offs. I don't mind either. And you closed it out with the Texans D as direct leverage off of a very chalky Anthony Richardson. So overall, I don't mind this build, Base Dad, and thank you for the submission. The next roster we will review today comes from Western Illinois Agger. This is a $50 single entry with 2,300 entrants. As you see, another Josh Allen double stack with James Cook and Khalil Shakir. So no Arizona bring back on this one. So I think just overall, I don't like double stacks with a mobile quarterback like Josh Allen. He derives a lot of his ceiling from his rushing upside. So if he's putting up a ceiling type game, so he's scoring 30 plus DK points, it usually includes a rushing touchdown, or in this particular example, 2. So this directly hurts Cooks. And with him priced at close to 7,000, you really needed 25 or 30 points from him alone to kind of put you on pace to win a tournament, which is basically impossible if Josh Allen is cannibalizing those opportunities and points on the ground from him. So I think that's probably an adjustment I would make on this build. So outside of the build stack, this roster has no other correlation, and I'd love to see that improved on future builds. Raheem Mostert is really good leverage off of a chalky Tyreek Hill, and you paired him with Justin Jefferson. So while many will see that pairing as not related at all, you're really doubling down on the bet of Tyreek Hill disappointing. And rosters that have Tyreek Hill are very unlikely to have Justin Jefferson. So you're now betting on Justin Jefferson instead of Tyreek, and you're not saying that the Dolphins are going to fail, however, that those points flow through Raheem Mostert. So I like that doubling down on that bet. And I don't mind JSN here. I think I'd rather see you pair him with Dulcich for a mini correlation instead of Mike Gesicki on this build. Auger, thank you for the submission this week. The next submission, comes from OWS subscriber Omaha Player. This is a $75 single entry into the 45 entrant contest. As a little sneak peek ahead, we are going to actually be reviewing a roster from our very own Mike Johnson in this same contest later in the show. So as you see, this is a Justin Herbert double stack with Josh Palmer and Ladd McConkey. No bring back on this roster. I know that the Justin Herbert double stack as a player block was something that JM discussed this weekend on the scroll and throughout his content this week. So personally, just kind of thinking about the coaching staff, Greg Roman, John Harbaugh, how they want to win. I think it's historically been through the run game. So if I'm building around Justin Herbert, which I think is totally viable, I think a Raider is absolutely required. So just kind of based on the rest of this roster, I'd rather see Brock Bowers instead of Taysom Hill. The roster then also features Mike Evans and Terry McLaurin in a mini correlation. I liked that a lot. That pairing was probably my highest owned pairing on the weekend. I also really like the correlation here between Kenneth Walker and Seattle D a lot. Seattle at home, facing a rookie quarterback making his first start. Not many better environments for chaos than the 12th man in Seattle. And then finally, you've got Joe Mixon here as a one-off. I really like that. So this is a roster that you see scored 120 points, didn't fare well, but it absolutely could. And I think it's important to not judge your builds by the result. If the why and the process is good, I think that's what's most important. So Omaha Player, this I think is a pretty well-constructed roster that I think with probably just one change from Taysom Hill up to Brock Bowers, I think has the possibility of being a tournament winner if things broke out a little differently for you. So thank you for the submission again. The next roster we'll review is a $10 entry in a 5-max contest from Sankey. This contest had 1,500 entrants and is a Josh Allen skinny stack. Brought it back with James Conner. So personally, I had 25% Josh Allen across my portfolio and started several rosters with these exact 3 players. So really like it. However, that's where the correlation ends on this roster. You've got Singletary, McConkey, Tyreek Hill, Mike Gesicki, and Terry McLaurin all as one-offs. So I think if you're playing Singletary, I'd rather see you bet on Justin Jefferson instead of Tyreek. Or instead of McConkey, I'd pair Tyreek with Brian Thomas Jr. at the same price for a mini correlation. And if you wanted to pay down at tight end, you could go Otten instead of Gesicki to correlate with Terry McLaurin. Again, you don't have to correlate your lineups, but for smaller fields, such as this 1,500 entrant tournament, it's just less things that you have to get right. And in a field that size, your roster doesn't have to be perfect. So those would be some adjustments that I would consider on a similar build, Sankey. But thank you for the submission this week. So the next roster we're going to review comes from Boom. Boom 114. This is a $50 single entry in a 1,200 entrant tournament. So it is a Richardson skinny with AD Mitchell. You brought it back with Tank Dell. I really like this start, especially with Josh Downs out. Personally, I'd like to see a little bit more correlation, as the Colts-Texans stack is all that this roster has in terms of correlation. So you've got one-offs with Connor and Walker at running back. I like them both, but I'd like to see some correlation, even if it's just with Walker and the Seattle D instead of the Chargers. The roster also features Godwin and Tyreek Hill, both solid plays. I would just rather see Kirk, Brian Thomas Jr., or Engram instead of Godwin or Pitts on this build. And then again, correlation, it isn't required to do well, as is evident by this 17th place finish. It's just less stuff that you have to get right. And when you do, it creates a path for all the way up to first place. So, Boom, appreciate the submission this week, and congrats on your 17th place finish here. The next roster comes from OWS member Bruce, a.k.a. Shady X. And this is a Sam Darnold skinny stack with Jordan Addison. You brought it back with Malik Neighbors. So a very nice contrarian start. The roster also features both James Conner and Trey McBride. So both solid plays. I just personally wouldn't play them together without at least one Buffalo Bill, as the likelihood of Arizona stomping Buffalo on the road, I think, is just such a minuscule percentage. And at $12,400 in salary combined, you likely need at least 50 points from Connor and McBride. So with that in mind, I think I would much rather see Keon Coleman or Khalil Shakir on this roster, probably instead of Terry McLaurin at the same price point. So this roster has Mostert as a one-off. So excellent leverage off of Achane or Tyreek Hill. I did like that. You've got DJ Moore here as the final piece. So at 6,500, he's a guy that you're looking for 25 to 30 points to be happy, which is well within his range of outcomes. But I think I would want to have some type of correlation with that. So maybe even consider playing the Titans D, kind of banking on, or telling a story of an early interception or sack fumble that leads to a touchdown that is leading Chicago to throw more. Again, just kind of speaks to like the incorporating more correlation or telling a little bit more of a story. But thank you for the submission this week, Bruce. So our next roster comes from OWS subscriber Cat Attack. This is a $100 single entry into the 44-44 entrant tournament. It is a Josh Allen skinny stack with no bring back. The Josh Allen skinny stack, very popular start for the OWS community this week. The roster then features a Mike Evans and Terry McLaurin mini correlation. Another grouping that we spoke very highly of on the scroll and in podcast this week. I think, as I mentioned previously, like my highest owned pairing on the slate. So I'm biased, but I really like it. Roster then has Devon A. Chan. Great leverage off of Tyreek Hill, who is one of, if not the highest owned player on the entire slate. I like it, especially in a 5,000 entrant tournament. Some good leverage. The roster then features Javonte Williams and Greg Dulcich, along with JSN as part of another game stack. So in theory, I like this. Personally, however, I think two Broncos is just too many. So Denver had the lowest scoring implied team total on the entire weekend. And that's just an offense on the road. I don't want to be betting on several pieces on the roster, especially with a rookie quarterback making his first ever start. So in my opinion, Dulcich and Javonte together is just too cute. You rounded out the roster, however, with the Vikings D taking on a very turnover-prone Danny Dimes. So I really did like that. Got them at minuscule ownership, sub 2%. So really liked several key pieces of this roster. Thank you for the submission, Cat Attack. The next roster comes from OWS subscriber J Dubs. This is a $50 single entry with 1,200 entrants in the contest. It is a Justin Fields skinny stack with George Pickens, and you brought it back with Drake London. Obviously, it didn't quite work out, but I really did like this start. The roster then features a Jefferson and Neighbors mini correlation, so I like that as well. So J-Dub, then you paired Joe Mixon and the Texans D together here as kind of a bet against the Anthony Richardson chalk. So I really did like that as well. And you wrapped up the lineup with Kenneth Walker and Zach Ertz. A really solid build. It didn't work out on this slate, but this is a roster that could win a tournament. Kind of a great example of a strong, well thought out construction that just didn't pan out. I think the only change I would have made personally would have been swapping Ertz for Dulcich for the correlation. Not required, but just something that I would have considered to pair with Kenneth Walker. Thank you for the submission this week. So the second to final roster we will be reviewing comes from my esteemed co-host this best ball season, M. Johnson 86. This is Mike Johnson's $75 single entry roster into that 44 entrant contest. It is an Anthony Richardson skinny stack with A.D. Mitchell, no bring back. So I like this start. I had several of my own rosters that began this way as well. The roster also features a Tyreek Hill and Evan Engram mini correlation that, while popular, was a really strong combo. I'm super high on both Tyreek Hill and Evan Engram this year, so I really liked that. Roster also has Rico Dowdle and Kenneth Walker as one-offs. I also had both of them in my player pool as well this past weekend. So there was a very realistic possibility, I felt, that Zeke was or is dust, and that Rico Dowdle would see 15 to 20 touches at 4,600 and 1% ownership. It didn't play out that way for us, but I liked the thought process. The final two pieces on this roster are Chris Godwin and Malik Neighbors. Both pieces that I had in my pool, but I think personally I'd rather see Jordan Addison instead of Godwin on this build to kind of pair with Neighbors as a mini correlation. And then Mike rounded it out here with the Falcons D, a bet against Justin Fields, who was a chalky quarterback. I think personally I would have preferred to see either the Dallas D or the Seattle D here to pair with the bets that you were making at running back. Or even the Cleveland D, as Dowdle has historically been more of a pass-catching back, so probably more heavily involved in a trailing game script. But appreciate the submission this week, Mike. And then last but not least, as we do every roster review, we will review my highest dollar single entry, which for me this past week was the $50 single entry, 4,500 entrants. It is a Jaden Daniels skinny stack with Terry McLaurin, brought it back with Mike Evans. So one of the things that I really am a big fan of and advocate for are keeping a tight player pool, kind of, picking a lane and going 100 miles an hour. So for me, I think I had about 200 lineups this week and had roughly a third of them, so 33% with Jaden Daniels and 25% or so with Josh Allen. So I think I had close to 60% of my builds with just those two quarterbacks kind of mixing and matching. This roster also has J.K. Dobbins and the Chargers correlation as a defense that I really liked at home. As you see, it's got Tyreek Hill as a one-off. I felt that was the best bet for the highest raw point score on the slate with CMC off this slate. So I had James Conner and Khalil Shakir as a mini correlation. When I first built this, I pivoted down to Jerome Ford as I really didn't want to punt at tight end. And I felt like Taysom Hill would go overlooked with Kyle Pitts, just I think 100 or 200 right more than him, right above him. So I also toyed with Jalen McMillan here instead of Shakir to kind of build more of that full game stack with like a Jaden Daniels, Terry McLaurin, and then bring it back with Evans and McMillan. That's a construction I really like with a mobile quarterback because, for him to hit ceiling, you're really banking on his rushing upside. So kind of going with a skinny stack there and bringing it back with multiple pieces, you're kind of playing for a shootout. Didn't quite pan out that way, but I think that's a very viable build. I just thought that Shakir offered a higher floor, higher upside to Jalen McMillan. So I think had I gone with McMillan, I would have probably gone with Ferguson at tight end to correlate with Ford or Engram to correlate with Tyreek Hill. So I think the end result would have been similar, but I wanted to share my thinking on this build. So I think just as a wrap, I just want to say thanks again for tuning in for all of your roster submissions this week. I ended up getting just shy of 50, which actually is a record for this show. So I wanted to, please don't get discouraged if I didn't get to yours this session. So, as we talked a lot about last year, winning is just so hard and things need to break your way. So I want to continue to encourage the OWS fam to stay disciplined as there's a lot of excitement with a new season. And my advice is just to continue to play within your bankroll. So thank you again for your roster submissions this week. And I will see you around the site and Discord throughout the week. And I hope to see you and your OWS avatar at the top of the leaderboard for week 2. Thanks again for tuning in.